Okay, now the books. Most people have been introduced to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by reading the book. Let's just briefly cover them. The first book was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was published in 1978. It was actually published by Pan Books, not the BBC, who had actually refused to publish it for some strange reason. It went to number one within 2 weeks. It sold 250,000 copies in the first 3 months, and to date it's sold over 15 million copies worldwide. In 1980, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe was published, and although adapted from the remaining 8 episodes of the radio series, the book was greatly changed. Those of us who were familiar with the radio and TV versions found this a little more confusing. Life, the Universe and Everything was published in 1982 and was originally written to exploit Douglas Adams', Doctor Who and Kirkitman scripts. It should have been turned into a second TV series, but there were disputes with the BBC and instead the story was written up as a book. So Long and Thanks for All the Fish was the 4th book and published in 1984. It was the first Hitchhiker's book originally written as a book and not adapted from a radio or TV script, and yet the story was still based on a workup written for a Doctor Who movie. So Long and Thanks for All the Fish was later adapted to become the 3rd radio series and was broadcast by the BBC in 2004. The final book, Mostly Harmless, was published in 1992. It's possibly the craziest of the books, and the story centres around the 2nd edition of the book, now taken over by the Vogons, Arthur and Trillian's daughter, a mildly deranged teenager, and was adapted to become the final radio series, which aired in 2005. It's interesting to note that sci-fi fans will passionately defend the Hitchhiker's book series. They're regarded with considerable affection, and although many newcomers to the series can laugh at the jokes and humour as new and innovative, many of us who read the books years ago find the humour as warm and familiar today as old friends. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy TV show was first conceived in 1978 as an animated TV series. Thankfully, they didn't do that. But at this point, we should consider what it was like for the BBC to consider such a science fiction production. Essentially, when you read the books, you'll see that some amazing effects are called for, and it must have been very difficult for them to actually try and plan how they were going to produce this. Firstly, this was an era of the ZX81 and the Atom personal computers. All you could do with these was to produce very basic computer special effects like underlining text and changing the colour on the screen background. Okay, things were a little bit better than that, but not much. The real big stuff was happening in the film industry with movies like Superman, which today looks really amateurish and cheap. Enter then the BBC, who were world renowned for effects such as the Tom Baker era Doctor Who with cheesy plastic costumes and flimsy cardboard walls. Some might think dependence on decent graphics would mean that Hitchhikers was doomed. It wasn't, as you'll see.
The Babelfish is small, yellow, leech-like, and probably the oddest thing in the universe. It feeds on brainwave energy, absorbing all unconscious frequencies and then excreting telepathically a matrix formed from the conscious frequencies and nerve signals picked up from the speech centers of the brain. The practical upshot of which is that if you stick one in your ear, you instantly understand anything said to you in any form of language.
Okay, so now you know where the Babelfish translation website got its name. Computer graphics, and this really can't be stressed enough, it's a myth, weren't advanced enough to assist in the production of this series. It was too early. So this will come as a shock to most people, but no computers were used at all in the production of any of the effects for this show. They were all created using traditional cell animation techniques. They weren't even done for the most part by the BBC. They were done by a genius called Rod Lord, who worked for a company called Pierce Studios. Here's a clip of Rod Lord being interviewed by the BBC about the effort it took to create the computer animation.
The drawings here, you've got, out of this huge mountain of drawings, you have things which really are just sort of little, very, very simple guides, pencil drawings, showing the detail of how you're going to plan out the sequence. And from them, you move, don't you, to things like this?
Yes, trade stuff. I mean, really, it's awful to have to disappoint so many computer experts, but it is a very traditional method of doing animation, actually. It's simply what everyone probably knows already about how Disney went about it, although the style's very different, and obviously we're not as complex as that in what we're doing here.
In the TV series, the book itself simply blew away the audience. It was beautifully animated, and along with the voice of Peter Jones, it thrilled the audience and still does today. Peter Jones was first choice to play the voice of the book on both the radio and the TV versions of the series. Douglas Adams once said, "I want someone with a Peter Jonesy sort of voice." And someone came back to them later and said, "Why don't we actually see if Peter Jones is interested in doing it?" By all intents and purposes, this guy is great. Peter Jones was a really nice bloke, and it's a shame that he's no longer with us. Many of the original actors from the radio series also took part in the TV series, and the only difference being Sandra Dickinson, who played Trillian, and David Dixon as Ford. It soon became apparent that this was going to be a major production, and the budget, which was almost the total budget for special effects for the light entertainments department of the BBC, it took up all the money basically in 1980. Other shows had to move to different channels because there wasn't enough money to be able to handle it. Silly Things took huge amounts of money, and this clip from Tomorrow's World, a TV show which extols the virtues of modern technology of the time, actually looks at Zaphod's second head. Check this clip out, it's great.
A model created by BBC Visual Effects Department that should be, and it took them less than 6 weeks, which is pretty good going. It's a model that's designed to look and act just like a human head. And they managed to create a head roll, a roving eye, a winking eyelid, a nod, and a moving mouth. The method behind all this owes nothing whatever to the ventriloquist dummy. No strings, no rods or levers. Instead, an ingenious adaptation of an ordinary radio control set like the ones used by model aircraft enthusiasts.
In the TV series, the Zaphod Beeblebrox was played by Mark Wing Davey, and it has to be pointed out that the actual head on his shoulder cost more than he did, a fact which he's never been impressed with. You look at these special effects, don't you, and you think they're a bit cheesy and they're a bit naff, but you've got to remember that in those days, these were amazing effects. Sandra Dickinson played Trillian, who graced the set with a sort of one-piece red glittery bathing costume, which was actually picked by a husband, Peter Davidson, whose own costume in the show was most certainly uncomplimentary. What most people don't know is that Peter Davidson, who had just been made the new Doctor Who of the era, had a significant part in the show as the dish of the day in the 4th episode, one of the funniest sequences in the series. By the way, that sequence was developed, as I mentioned earlier, in the stage play at the Rainbow Theatre and was not from the radio series. I really don't want to show you much of the TV series because I don't want to piss off the BBC, to be honest with you. I think they've been absolutely wonderful in supporting Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy ever since it was aired in 1978 on the radio. They've always been big fans. It's really obvious when you look on the website, the BBC website. You can see it's still the biggest resource for Hitchhiker's Guide fans. The TV show is my favourite version of the saga because it's lovingly produced and superbly acted. The one and only interactive fiction computer game based on the series was designed by Douglas Adams and Infocom's Steve Maretsky. It was first released in 1984 for the Apple IIe, Commodore 64, the Amiga, the Atari and the IBM PC. It was a superb collaboration between the two guys, usually conducted over a modem and across the Atlantic. And when it first came out in a 5¼ floppy disk, it was coupled with the Jujunta Peril sunglasses things that Zaphod Beeblebrox wears to stop him seeing anything that he would consider to be dangerous or frightening. The Infocom adventure is considered by many to be one of the best computer games of the 80s. The puzzles were wonderfully crafted and never too easy. It was one of the best-selling games of 1985, shifting over 250,000 copies that year alone. The original is now only available in the Lost Treasures of Infocom Compendium, of famous Infocom games. However, on September the 21st, 2004, the BBC launched the 20th anniversary edition of the game. It's now done in Flash, and it was remodelled by Ron Lord, who did the animations for the TV series.